You know that feeling. When you look at something that used to be totally essential, like, I don't know, an old paper road map, now we've got GPS.
Yeah, or maybe like an old legal code written centuries ago for a completely different kind of society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you just realize how much the world has completely shifted. It really makes you wonder.
How do these big systems, systems of belief or guidance, how do they even keep up?
Right. Do they evolve or do they sort of become
Yeah.
less relevant?
That's a perfect way to put it. I mean, humanity's facing challenges today, global scale stuff, environment, social dynamics.
Things our ancestors couldn't possibly have imagined.
Not even close. So it raises these huge questions about where we find guidance, where we find structure in a world changing this fast.
Absolutely. And that whole dynamic, that tension, is exactly what we're digging into today in this deep dive.
We've been looking at this really fascinating academic source. It's titled Bahá'í Faith, Sole Modern Religion.
And it puts forward a pretty bold argument, definitely thought-provoking, about how religions, well, how they evolve or maybe need to evolve.
Yeah, it's not just about one faith in isolation. This source actually proposes a whole academic framework for understanding religious history and development itself.
Right. The core idea it really builds on is this concept called progressive revelation.
Mm-hmm.
The source basically argues that divine guidance isn't static. It's delivered sequentially, like throughout history, in stages.
Tailored, it suggests, to humanity's evolving capacity and the circumstances of the time. Kind of like a curriculum that gets more advanced as the student learns more.
That's a great analogy. So from this academic viewpoint, religions are seen as divinely inspired? Sure.
But their specific teachings, their laws, their social structures, they're designed for a particular context.
The social, cultural, intellectual state of the people, the era they appear in. Makes sense.
So each major religion is like a new chapter in one big unfolding book of guidance.
That's pretty much the analogy the source uses, yeah. It argues each new chapter fulfills the purpose of the last one.
But it also introduces the specific teachings, the frameworks needed for the next stage of human civilization.
And its central point, its conclusion, is that the Baha'i Faith is the most recent stage in this progression.
Specifically designed, the source claims, to meet the spiritual and social needs of our modern globalized world.
Addressing challenges that, according to the source, older religions, while vital in their time, are just fundamentally, structurally not equipped to handle today.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. The source starts its argument by looking at what it sees as the limitations of key older religious systems.
Right, when viewed through this lens of today's global society.
It kicks off with Judaism. It grounds its origins in, that tribal covenant focused specifically on the Israelites. And the source notes how many of its laws, dietary laws, ritual purity, things like that, were inherently tied to that specific historical context.
And the insight here, according to the source's analysis, is that while those laws were absolutely crucial back then for establishing and keeping an identity for a specific group,
they weren't really designed as a universal blueprint for the whole world today.
Right. So the source argues that Judaism, from this academic viewpoint, lacks that clear, explicit, universal framework for things like, say, interfaith unity or global governance.
Because its covenant was primarily with one nation in one specific time.
What's really interesting, though, in this part of the source is how it talks about the Jewish expectation of a personal Messiah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the source frames this expectation as being fulfilled, from the Christian perspective, obviously, in Jesus Christ.
Okay.
And then later, according to the Baha'i perspective it's presenting, in the figures of the Bab and Baha'u'llah.
So it highlights how different traditions see the continuation, or maybe it's the culmination, of prophecy playing out.
Exactly. Okay, so moving on, the source then takes a look at Christianity.
And it acknowledges right up front the radical universality of its initial message. Concepts like universal love, salvation for everyone, transcending those ethnic lines.
But, and there's a but, the source immediately points to the fragmentation that happened historically. Pretty deep fragmentation.
Yeah, it highlights major doctrinal disputes, cites things like the debates over the Trinity or faith versus works.
Stuff that led directly to huge schisms and, let's be honest, historically, religious conflicts and wars, especially in Europe.
And then there's the whole issue of the church getting entangled with political power throughout history. That's another major limitation the source points to.
It mentions things like the Crusades, the church's role in colonialism.
Arguing these actions fundamentally contradicted that core spiritual mission of unity and love.
The source also suggests that Christianity lacks a clear institutional way to achieve global unity beyond, individual conversion or evangelization.
Which, from the source's perspective, often ended up looking more like cultural imposition than genuine, respectful integration of different peoples.
Right. So if you connect this back to the bigger argument the source is building.
It seems to be suggesting that while the message of Christianity had that universal spark, the structures that grew out of it and the historical actions taken,
They struggled, in the source's view, to really adapt to a truly pluralistic, interconnected world without causing more division.
Okay, so next up in the source's analysis is Islam.
Right. It recognizes Islam's revelation as providing this incredibly comprehensive legal and social system, super relevant, necessary even for 7th century Arabia, bringing order, justice.
Absolutely. But then the source offers a critique of Sharia law, specifically when viewed in a modern context.
How so?
Well, it argues that Sharia, as it developed historically, became very rigidly tied to medieval social structures.
Making it difficult, in the source's analysis, to apply it flexibly or adapt it smoothly to the really complex, pluralistic, fast-changing societies we have today.
And it points to those persistent, sometimes violent sectarian divisions within Islam, specifically mentioning the ongoing Sunni-Shia conflicts in places like Syria and Yemen as stark examples.
Yeah, that disunity is hard to ignore.
The source also brings up how jihad is interpreted in some traditional frameworks, arguing that certain readings clash with contemporary universal human rights norms.
Okay.
But a really key, maybe fundamental limitation the source identifies for Islam, especially contrasting it with the Baha'i view of ongoing guidance, is that concept of the Qur'an's finality.
Khatama Luguwa, the seal of the prophets.
Exactly. The source argues that this concept effectively prevents the kind of doctrinal evolution and legislative adaptation that it sees as absolutely essential for a religion to stay relevant and guiding in the modern world.
So that's a crucial insight from the source's perspective. It's not just the content of the teachings.
Right. It's also the structure, the mechanisms for interpretation, for evolution, or the lack thereof.
So the source's analysis of these older faiths essentially concludes they face these inherent structural doctrinal limits.
Limits that, in its view, make them insufficient for really guiding humanity effectively through the unique global challenges of the 21st century.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, as you said earlier.
Yeah, because the source then pivots. It starts to argue why the Baha'i Faith, from its academic standpoint, is uniquely equipped for these modern needs.
And it points to what it calls its inherent doctrinal innovations.
First and foremost, number one on the list is the explicit foundational principle of the unity of humanity.
And the source draws a direct contrast here with what it calls exclusivist salvation theologies found in some traditional views of older religions.
Right. It mentions historical concepts like extra ecclesiam nulla salus in Christianity outside the church, no salvation.
Or certain interpretations of the kafir dichotomy in Islam, drawing that sharp line, often condemnatory, between believers and non-believers.
The source argues that Baha'i teachings completely differently, explicitly, and fundamentally reject all forms of prejudice: racial, national, class, religious, all of it.
Viewing all of humanity as just one single family.
And it includes that really powerful quote from Baha'u'llah cited in the source that just drives it home.
The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. That's about as clear a statement of universalism for a global age as you can get.
Absolutely. Then another big point the source really emphasizes is the harmony of science and religion.
Ah, yeah. It contrasts this with historical conflicts and even some ongoing tensions in older traditions.
Citing things like the church versus Galileo or, contemporary debates about creationism versus evolution, where religion has sometimes pushed back against scientific findings.
So the source argues Baha'i theology sees science and religion differently.
Totally differently. Not as opposing forces, but as two complementary ways of understanding reality. It actually mandates that true religion must agree with scientific truth.
Which fosters intellectual progress, avoids those conflicts the source highlights elsewhere.
Gender equality is another huge one the source focuses on.
How so?
It states very clearly that Baha'i teachings explicitly affirm the full equality of women and men. Views it as essential for human progress, actually.
And this is contrasted in the source with traditional interpretations in some older scriptures.
Yeah, it gives examples like certain readings of Pauline theology in the New Testament, citing 1 Timothy 2.12 on women's roles.
Okay.
Or traditional interpretations of Quranic male guardianship, citing verses like 4.34.
Got it. The source also dives into Baha'i principles on global governance and collective security, right?
Yes, it highlights Baha'u'llah's specific calls to establish a world commonwealth.
Like a unified global system with a universal legal code.
Exactly, envisioning that kind of structure. And this is put in stark contrast to the nation-state divisions and conflicts.
Which the source attributes, at least partly, to the lack of such a unifying framework in older religious systems.
And this analysis goes beyond just the core doctrines. It looks at the institutional structure, too.
How does that play in?
Well, the source looks at what it sees as issues in older religious institutions. Things like reliance on centralized clerical hierarchies, the Pope, the ulama.
Which the source argues can sometimes resist necessary reform and adaptation.
That's the argument. And it also points to how rigid adherence to scriptural literalism in some traditions can lead to, well, stagnation on social issues.
Citing examples like young earth creationism or some of the harsher apostasy laws.
So the source presents the Baha'i administrative order as a kind of deliberate solution to these potential problems.
Noting specifically there's no clergy.
No clergy at all.
Yeah.
Instead, the religion is governed by elected bodies, local, national, international, called spiritual assemblies.
And the source highlights how these operate. By consultation. Applying teachings flexibly.
Yes, applying them flexibly to specific contexts. And crucially, the source emphasizes the role of the Universal House of Justice.
The supreme governing body.
Right. It points out that the Baha'i writings explicitly give this body the power to legislate on matters not specifically covered in the original texts.
So it provides a built-in mechanism for dynamic adaptation. For new social realities, future challenges.
Precisely. As humanity evolves, the source even gets into prophecy.
Oh, really? How does it handle that?
It argues that Baha'i interpretations offer a framework for understanding those apocalyptic prophecies, like Christ's return or the Islamic Yawm al-Qiyamah, the Day of Resurrection.
But not as literal predictions of the world ending in fire and brimstone?
No, not physical destruction. More as symbolic language describing the arrival of a new divine revelation, a new spiritual era dawning.
Interesting.
And the source makes the academic claim that the timing and nature of the Baha'i faith actually align with scriptural expectations from older traditions.
Interpreting prophecies like Isaiah's Prince of Peace or John's promise of a comforter.
As foretelling the coming of Baha'u'llah, thus fulfilling those prophecies according to its specific interpretive framework.
Which ties everything neatly back to the source's comparative analysis, doesn't it? Especially its focus on the persistent failure, in its view, of older systems to achieve real global unity.
Even when they often preach unity in principle, the source reinforces this by citing current examples of disunity.
Like Christianity still being highly fragmented, it mentions Pew Research figures. Something like 45,000 denominations.
Over 45,000 globally, yeah. And it points again to the ongoing, often violent Sunni-Shia conflicts within Islam.
Using current examples like Syria and Yemen as evidence of that deep, unresolved split.
And its view on Judaism, while respectful of its history, is that it's primarily an ethno-religious identity.
Which, in the source's analysis, doesn't really present itself as a universal framework aiming to unite all of humanity under one global religious system.
Right. And similarly, it suggests traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, while obviously profound and diverse, lack that specific kind of prophetic framework focused on setting up a unified global social and governance structure.
Okay, so the source's core claim here is pretty direct.
Right.
Only the Baha'i faith, in its view, provides that systematic approach doctrinally, institutionally specifically designed for unifying a global society.
Yes. It points to things like mandatory interfaith dialogue as a core Baha'i activity.
Rooted in recognizing the divine source of all major religions, seeing their prophets as educators in one single progressive system.
Exactly. And it highlights Baha'i laws on economic justice, too. Teachings on wealth distribution, prohibiting monastic withdrawal.
Which the source sees as encouraging active, responsible engagement with the world and its problems, not retreating from them.
Right. And environmental ethics are also included. Baha'i teachings presenting nature as a reflection of the divine.
Underscoring a spiritual duty, basically, for environmental stewardship.
So pulling all these threads together, what's the bottom line, according to this academic source?
Well, its main conclusion is pretty unequivocal. It argues that while ancient religions were profoundly relevant, necessary even in their own historical contexts.
Their structures, their doctrines, in its view, limit their ability to effectively handle the unique complexities, the global scale challenges of the 21st century.
It sums up its case for why it considers the Baha'i Faith the sole viable religion for today by pointing to, well, a few key things.
Its doctrinal comprehensiveness, covering all these modern issues.
That's built-in institutional flexibility, that adaptability we talked about.
And its explicit unifying vision for a peaceful, just global society.
The source uses that powerful analogy from the Christian scriptures, Matthew 9:1-17.
The old wineskins analogy.
Right.
It suggests older religions, while venerable, are like those old skins.
Structures that, in its view, are just not suitable anymore for holding the new wine.
Yeah.
The teachings and societal needs of today's world.
And it states its academic position clearly, based on its analysis of progressive revelation and modern needs. The Baha'i Faith, according to this source,
represents the culmination of religious evolution, making prior dispensations, while respected, fundamentally insufficient as the main guiding force for humanity now.
It's definitely a bold academic stance, arguing that this specific stage of human development we're in demands a religious system designed precisely for global consciousness, unity, and collective action.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has certainly given us a really detailed map of this source's argument, from its critiques of older systems for today's world to its case for the Baha'i Faith's unique suitability.
Yeah, and understanding this specific academic perspective, why it argues what it does, is valuable, I think. It offers this complete framework, right or wrong, for interpreting religious history and thinking about how different systems might tackle our current and future challenges.
It's an attempt to provide a single, coherent story for religious diversity and proposes a path forward.
It definitely leaves you with a lot to chew on. I mean, if you accept the source's premise, just for a moment, that divine guidance is progressive, that it adapts.
And that certain structures are needed for future evolution.
What does that even suggest about the challenges humanity might face down the road, challenges we can't even imagine today?
Right. And what kinds of spiritual or social frameworks might be needed to meet those needs whenever they arise? It's a fascinating question to ponder.